Hi, my name's Stephen Hand from Archery Supplies, and today I want to talk about Norman Archery. You're going to say, why are you talking about Norman Archery? Norman Archery was one of the largest archery dealers, distributors in America. So they were the first company I started dealing with when I started my archery shop. So back in 1990s, so 30, over 30 years ago, they're the first company I went to. So I actually went and visited Norman Archery about 27 years ago. So I went there to have a look about how archery shops run, how they do things, and how it's different to what I'm doing, and where I should be looking forward into the future about how to set up my business and how to do things better. So I wanted to sort of discuss that. So Norman Archery is in Oklahoma. So it's in the middle of the US. And my experiences with Norman Archery was amazing. The lady who ran it was Tammy, and she would be working every night till 11 o'clock. You'd send her an email, she'd send it straight back to you. It was an amazing service. She'd place an order. Next day, pretty much next day, it'd be sent out. And within a few days, it was here in Australia. Now, you're probably going to say, why did you use Norman Archery when you're in Australia and not one of the local distributors in Australia? Well, the original reason was the original distributors in Australia wouldn't supply me. So that was kind of how it sort of started, and that's how I started my business. So I was in Canberra. I was the state coach, club coach, and I wanted to sell some archery gear because the shop in town literally wasn't open and didn't have anything, and I wanted to supply stuff to people I was looking after. Abbey Archery, who was a distributor here in Australia, wouldn't supply me. So I was like, well, I'll go to America. So I went to them, and I was buying quite considerable amounts of archery gear. So I think in my first year it was $50,000. Next year it was $250,000, and then I think it was $750,000. So within 3 years, I was a reasonable size and still part-time and working in the public service. So amazing company, and I wanted to go and see how they did things. So that's what I want to talk about. So when I flew into Oklahoma, it was just after the Oklahoma bombings. And I'm going to say the hospitality of the people in Norman Archery was amazing. So I actually stayed with Tammy in her house, and it was kind of funny. I was expecting when I get there that she'd be really wealthy because she worked all the time, like 7 days a week, all the time. But that wasn't the case. She had a normal house, a normal loan on a car. She just worked a lot. So that was kind of a bit of an eye-opener for me. Now, the people who owned the company were very wealthy, so they owned oil. So in Oklahoma has oil, and they owned oil fields, and Norman Archery was the family business. So, but that still didn't none of this clicked to me. The story I received from Norman Archery is they built it up from the ground up and built this massive complex. And I want to sort of talk about it, and when I say complex, I'm going to say the building was probably 100 meters long by 50 meters wide, and it was huge as far as high. So they had, you'll see mine here is like 2.4 meters. They were probably 5 meters up, and they had pallet racking to the ceiling, and they would use like these lifts to go and pick items. So their common items were at ground level, and then the bigger items would be at higher level, and they'd use like lifts to get those down. So it was like a huge supermarket, but much higher up. So like it's a wholesaler for archery gear, but it was big. And I want to talk about how it was sort of set up. So the owner of the business had a front office. I'm going to say, in me dealing with Norman Archery, I never dealt with him. I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. So, and when I went to Norman Archery, I had very little to do with him because he was out and he was a bit of I'm going to say, living the Playboy lifestyle. So that's fine. But they had lots of workers there. So they had I'm going to say tele call center. So people answering phone calls, doing orders, probably about 30 people in the office. Now these people would take phone orders, email orders. Back then they were by fax, and they would type them into a system. Then they had people to pull the orders. So they basically had shopping trolleys, and they'd run down these aisles, throw the items in a shopping trolley, bring them back, and then someone else would invoice them up. So there was basically a two-step process. The order would be produced, a person would go and pick the items, and then a person would enter them on an invoice. So basically there was a double checking process, and then they were shipped. So people in the office entering the order, person then pulls the order, and then a person then invoices the order. So basically like a double thing. So that way you made sure that the item was in stock, if that makes sense. So you might say, well, I want to buy a Hoyt Altus bow. You go and check out the back, you don't have one. So then for it come back as not fulfilled. So when they do up the order, that item would be then back ordered. Okay, so it was a double checked. Now they had an arrow making area, so they had these round tables, like Lazy Susans with bits and burgers. And I think they had 3 of them, so they had people making arrows all the time. So about 3 people making arrows, and they also had an automatic fletching machine, which was a machine that does 3 arrows at once, and there was 1 person on those. So making arrows was a huge part of Norman Archery's business. About 3 people upstairs making arrows, 3 or 4 people upstairs making arrows. Now there was also a person whose job it was to count feathers and stick them in bags. So feathers would come in big boxes of about 1,000 feathers or more, and they would count them and put them in bags. Now her ability to count feathers and stick them in bags quickly was amazing. I could never do it, and I assume it was a low-paid job, but just incredible how fast she would do it, and it was all so stacked and neat as you'd kind of see feathers if you buy them in bags of 100, all done by hand. So Norman Archery, huge. Now when I was in Oklahoma, they took me to all the archery shops, or most of the archery shops in Oklahoma to look at, to see how they run and see what an archery shop looks like. Now Norman Archery also owned an archery shop called Oklahoma Archery, and it was a kind of a smallish building, much smaller than this. And the counters were in the center, and hopefully I can pull a picture of it. And then they had bows around the outside. They employed about 5 staff there. And to their view of it, they were one of the busiest archery shops in Oklahoma. There was other archery shops in Oklahoma, Pat's Archery. I think there was about 3 others I visited. Pat's had a dart system, so an indoor shooting range, and a video system. So like rolling forward, I was like, well, how do you get to this big? Because the building would have cost a fortune, the fit out would have cost a fortune, the staff, how do you get there? Because I've been doing this for 30 years, and you can see what I've got, which is kind of something pretty simple and pretty budget that I've put together. And this is 30 years of working to get to this point. And so it was kind of always a bit of a, how do I get there? If I work hard, this is where I'm going to get to. But that was the goal of how to get there, and that was my vision for the archery business. So that's why I wholesale and retail, and there has been times where I've only wholesaled, but it didn't work because shops didn't buy off me. So I do have shops buying off me, but I have more shops buy off me if I have a retail shop than if I was just wholesale. So that's kind of a bit interesting. I can go into why that occurs, but so Norman Archery, rolling on years. One of my viewers said Oklahoma doesn't have many archery shops or something like that. I was like, no, you've got this big archery shop. And then I looked and they've closed down. I'm like, what happened there? They had money, it was a big business, they went to all the ATA shows, they were spending lots of money, they had these big thick catalogues which are about that thick, it was a pretty amazing business, and it's all closed down. So I was like, well, maybe they didn't make the money I thought they were making. Now I'm going to say the profits in archery are minimal. Like, wholesale, they might be running on less than 10%. And then the costs of staff and all that, and the costs of the infrastructure are quite high. So there was a point there, and hopefully I've got photos, where they closed Oklahoma Archery and set up a bigger archery shop, which they called Norman Archery. So I'm guessing at that stage they closed their wholesale business down. I'm guessing. But they set up an indoor range and a much bigger shop. So it was a much bigger retail shop, and I think that's where they thought they were going to go. However, 3 years later that was closed, and that business does not exist today. So I look back on it and I'm like, is it a business model that failed? Is the cost too high? And I look at my own business. I don't have a sign out the front because they want $10,000 to put a sign in. The racks that I have are the racks we built to keep costs down. The slat wall that we've got here, it's $200 a piece if you buy it off a retailer here. I imported it from China, and I think I paid about $40 a piece. So it's a massive saving. So it's all about keeping costs low to try and make some money. For me, I could never get, and I've grown, but I never got to the stage where Norman Archery was at. Now there is archery shops in America who are still functioning and obviously doing well and are big. You're going to go Lancaster, you're going to go Papes, you're going to go Kinsey's, but there's been a whole bunch who have closed down. I'm going to do videos and I'm going to discuss those. And I look at some of them and I'm like, how do they make money? So I'm going to say one of my friends, Rick McKinney, who's a world famous archer, said to me, the way to become a millionaire from archery is to start off as a multi-millionaire. And that's how you become a millionaire. He said that to me when I was in my 20s. And I was always like, that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, because you lose so much money being in the archery industry. Anyway, I'm Stephen Hand from Archery Supplies. Thanks for watching.